Okay, so I'm here to talk about staring at graphs as a service. Like Abe mentioned, having people staring at graphs is clearly the answer to monitoring. So it's a service that you can subscribe to. But actually, that might not be the most realistic, so maybe not staring at graphs might actually be a better service. I'm Katherine Daniels. I work at Game Changer, obligatory, we're hiring. I am, as mentioned, beer ops on Twitter, and I am occasionally full of angst there. So I'm here to tell you a couple stories about what you could do when you realize that your monitoring sucks. You get so fed up, you decide that you need to change things, and there's a lot of choices that you need to make along the way. It's kind of a monitoring operations, choose your own adventure. Now, most people don't set out to create monitoring that sucks, but this can happen for a variety of reasons. Maybe you didn't know the right tools to use. Maybe you just didn't know how to use them effectively. Maybe your monitoring originally was pretty good, but it didn't scale up as your company grew. Or maybe you just didn't have the experience to really know what things were the right things and what things were the wrong things to do. So, yeah, if you aren't careful, you can end up with something like this. This is Xenos. I used to complain about Xenos on Twitter a lot. I one time wrote very sad poetry about it. So there's a lot of red here. It's sad and angry looking. Some of the occurrences, the counts of how many times these events have alerted, are in the hundreds or thousands, or some of them are hundreds of thousands. Some of the slightly less red ones are the acknowledged alerts, and they've been acknowledged for weeks or months, and they're just sitting there sad. Now, we can probably all agree that this is monitoring that sucks. And for various reasons, various choices that were made, this was at one point accepted as an okay way of doing things, and maybe the only way that things could conceivably have been done. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, what the fuck, how could anyone think that this was okay, day after day, week after week, month after month? Now, maybe some of you are lucky enough to have never had to deal with something that red and horrible. But most of us have probably been at a similar point at one stage or another in our careers where your monitoring sucks. So it sucks. So now what? Where do you go from here? Now, whether or not it's gotten so bad that all you do is come in the morning and look at your Nagios or your Xenos and it's all red and you just sit there and weep to yourself. But if it gets to the point where your monitoring isn't working out the way you want it to, you need to change it. You need to do something about it. Now, this realization usually doesn't come out of nowhere. Normally, there's some kind of outage that makes you realize that, oh, your monitoring missed something. So, if your monitoring actually did miss something and it wasn't some freak series of hurricanes that took out all of EC2 or Scandinavian spider farts that screwed up all of your IOPS, if your monitoring missed something that went wrong, how do you fix it? Well, if your monitoring missed something, you clearly weren't monitoring enough things, so monitor all of the things. Add some more checks to Nagios, add some more graphs to Graphite, maybe log some more files and alert on their contents. Because if you're monitoring all of the things, ever, then you can't miss anything anymore. But even if you're monitoring all the things, you might have another outage. Maybe some alerts were configured to be warnings instead of errors, or errors instead of critical, and people thought, oh, that wasn't a big deal, but it turns out it was. The site went down, so maybe those things were more critical than you originally gave them credit for. So, make more of your checks critical. If things are red, people will pay attention to them, and nobody will miss anything. You saw Xenos, it was red, you have to look at that, you can't ignore it. So, some things are obviously critical, like Pingdom says, oh, by the way, your entire site's down, you might want to do something about that. But maybe you had a high database response time and you thought it wasn't that big a deal, but then all your API calls timed out and your site crashed anyway. Whoops. So, mark everything as critical. You know, even if things don't need to be resolved right away, just leave them there as critical, acknowledge them so people don't forget that they're broken. But, oh shit, even though everything's critical and you're monitoring all the things, outages keep happening. Maybe things aren't straight out getting missed, but you realize that there's some reliability issues, like Rails crashes 20 times a day. I'm not here to pick on Rails, really. So at this point, people decide, oh, well, Rails needs to be restarted 20 times a day, you can't trust software. It's unreliable, just across the board. Now, granted, some software is more or less reliable than others, but I've run into people who say, oh, well, Nagios missed something. It's clearly because Nagios itself is terrible. Or, oh, Monet didn't restart a service the way we wanted it to. It's clearly because Monet itself is terrible. People don't consider that there could be other reasons for these failures. Like, maybe the software was trying to do the right thing, but it was configured wrong, because it's software, it's dumb. It does what you tell it to do, and if you don't tell it to do the right thing, it's not going to do the right thing. Or maybe a human being missed something, but because you have a terrible blame culture, they decided to point the finger at software instead, because they didn't want to get yelled at. Either way, it leads to having people sit around and babysit the infrastructure. They log into computers and they do computer things and they restart processes. It's not fun. Now, there are some things that human eyes are better at looking at. We're very good at detecting patterns. One time I worked with some really custom in-house software where really the only way to tell that it was failed was a very particular pattern of the graphs of one of its metrics. It was just this one thing, and it was fairly easy to say, okay, you know what, we'll just have people just occasionally glance up at that dashboard, make sure that the graph is not doing the wrong thing. Which was easier in the short or maybe even medium term than writing a custom algorithm, because algorithms are hard to detect that automatically. But obviously, that didn't scale well. The more graphs that you find yourself having to look at, the easier it is for something to slip through the cracks. So, hire more babysitters. If somebody missed somebody took too long to respond to an incident because they were busy looking at that other graph or looking at all the 20, 30 red alerts in Xenos, maybe you just need to hire more people. Because that way you can spread out the load a little more, maybe, make things a little less stressful for your whole team. But again, it doesn't really scale well. You might be able to keep doing that up to a point, but depending on your hiring practices, you're going to run out of people who are willing to sit in a chair and stare at graphs all day. Or you just run out of money to hire that many people, because you've got a lot of servers. That's a lot of servers to log into and babysit. But if things are kept mostly up and running this way, oftentimes management might not see that there's that much incentive to dig into why the monitoring still kind of sucks, which can happen for various reasons. You could be at a startup where you need to get features out really, really fast so your competitors don't beat you and steal all of your venture capital. Or you could be at a big corporate environment where stuff like increasing shareholder profit is more important than whether or not the ops team is happy. But whatever the reason, you might find yourself doing operations, doing monitoring, where you just have to keep stuff up and running well enough so that the developers can keep adding more features. And you realize that you don't have time to do any real work that would make your lives easier or make things a little more reliable, a little more stable, because you're too busy firefighting and staring at Xenos and weeping. So this is a pile of various mobile devices that I had around. The reason for this is that once upon a time, story time here, I found myself and my team being yelled at because something was failing, one feature was failing on mobile devices. Customers had noticed and customers had complained. Now, my team hadn't actually been told that we needed to monitor this feature, or even that it was in production. But management decided we had failed, it needed to be monitored right now, or preferably 5 minutes ago. And at the time, there was no way built into this feature, this product, to automatically determine whether or not it was failing. The only way to tell reliably, without half the results being false negatives or false positives, was to have people pick up the device, try the feature, and see with their eyes, with their hands, if it was working. And management decided that because this needed to be monitored 5 minutes ago, that that's what we were going to do. So they handed us a stack of mobile devices and said, hey, you need to check this by hand on each of these devices every hour, 24/7, indefinitely. I may have complained about this on Twitter multiple times. Now, as operations people, when we're doing monitoring, it's interrupt-driven enough as it is, and it's been noted that interruptions cost 15 to 20 minutes each in terms of lost focus, lost productivity. So forcing one interruption every hour made it ridiculously difficult. That's, a quarter of your time that you've just lost focus, and you're like, what the hell was I doing before I had to check these stupid mobile devices? So it was really bad for getting any kind of productive work done. Now, I mentioned that this feature had been put into production without the ops team being aware of that. This was kind of symptomatic of a cultural problem, which was a breakdown of trust and communication. And at the time, things were kind of fragile. It seemed kind of sensible to tell each team to just keep their head down, buckle down, focus on their own work. So the ops team, despite being responsible for keeping these things up and running and monitoring them, wasn't told what the development team was planning. They weren't part of those meetings, because if they were in development meetings and planning meetings, who would stare at the graphs? Who would watch Xenos to make sure it's okay? True story. On the other side of things, the dev team was under so much pressure to keep churning out feature after feature that there was no time to fix bugs that would have made things easier, stopped stuff from crashing 20 times a day, which spiraled into something that's probably a little too familiar. Yeah. Except, maybe in this story, you have a third silo. You have the dev team, you have the ops team, and then you have the DevOps team. Because management heard that DevOps was the new hotness that was going to fix all of their problems, but didn't really understand the implications for cultural changes that were actually required to make that work. So in addition to having 3 silos, each of these teams had their own tools, their own processes, their own workflows, or lack thereof, with no easy way of sharing work or communication or really anything between them. And that kind of failed. It tried to fix bad monitoring, but it ended up making it worse. The big picture got lost, so instead of people asking, what do we need to do to monitor our site and our app effectively to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to, it became, how do we turn the ops team into a human version of PagerDuty that stares at graphs and stares at Xenos and then yells at other people when things go wrong? Well, you really can't do that. But as it turns out, there's another story we could tell where you don't have to. So that was the wrong way of doing things. Each of those decisions might have made sense at the time, but stacked on top of each other, it kind of spiraled and led to a pretty epic fail where you're stuck and you can't really get out of it. Because as the size and complexity of your organization and your product grow, as technical debt grows, and as trust and communication break down, it's harder and harder to get out of that situation. So really, now what? These knee-jerk reactions really didn't work out. They were kind of, oh my god, the site's down, get it up, get it up, get it up. It was reactive instead of proactive, and it tends to make your monitoring suck even more. The decisions that we make in monitoring, in operations, don't exist in a vacuum. You have to look beyond each individual choice and consider how the sum of the choices affect the big picture. So how do we get to monitoring love? We all want one of these stickers, maybe you have one of these stickers, but how do we get there? So you monitor key components. Instead of going all the things and monitoring everything, figure out what's key and focus on those things. If nobody cares about the status of a particular check, just don't monitor it. Also, keep in mind that just because something is being monitored or being logged doesn't mean you have to alert on it. Some people tend to conflate these things. Anything that's monitored is something that's alerted on. As was mentioned in Boston in March, alert fatigue is probably one of the biggest problems that we're facing right now. So don't exhaust your ops team with alerts that aren't useful, that aren't actionable. Also consider making sure that you don't have multiple checks for the same thing, which if your teams are distributed or aren't communicating well, then this can happen. Somebody says, hey, add a check for this. Somebody goes off and does it, but doesn't tell anyone. So somebody on the next shift or whatever the next day comes along and adds the check again, and all of a sudden you're getting 4 alerts for the same goddamn thing because nobody can be bothered to talk to each other. So after you've figured out what actually needs to be monitored, it's important to figure out what alerts and what metrics are actually critical. If something has been alerting for weeks or months without any action being taken, if something has been acknowledged for so long that people have forgotten it was even there, or if nobody can find a single stakeholder who cares whether this check is passing or failing, it might not actually be critical. So find out what's actually critical and prioritize those things. Your goal is to actually fix your monitoring, so don't be afraid to deprioritize or even delete some checks as you're trying to fix things. Yeah, because if things were critical, you would actually take the time to fix them. You wouldn't acknowledge them and leave them for months. If they're that unimportant, that's not what critical means. That's not what that word means. The problem with making everything critical, yeah, it's red, it's important, people will look at it and see it, but it makes red your baseline. Now, if you delete critical checks, things aren't going to magically fix themselves. Just because you don't have any checks that are defined as critical doesn't mean everything's fixed and perfect. But your goal should be working every day, every sprint, every cycle, whatever, towards a zero-error baseline. You want to get away from having red be your normal. Because teams need to be able to prioritize in order to work effectively, and that can't be done if you're only ever firefighting. So once you've stopped treating everything as a critical emergency, you can take a step back and prioritize what work actually needs to be done. This means that if there are things that need babysitting, stop babysitting them and fix them. If Rails keeps crashing, figure out why and fix it. Because monitoring is not actually a replacement for bug fixing. It might seem obvious, but I've seen people who've decided that having a team of a lot of low-paid, underqualified people just restarting services all the time is more cost-effective than having people, the developers, actually track down these bugs and fix them. In addition to fixing bugs with your site or your app itself, fixing the infrastructure also means taking the time to get the pieces of your monitoring system itself set up correctly. So if you have a Nagios server that's a beautiful, unique snowflake that it's going to fall apart if you look at it wrong, and who hasn't had one of those at one point, don't just sit there and wait for it to crap out on you, but do something about it. I used to have one of those. I complained about it a lot on the internets, but I fixed it. Right now, I've got Chef and Sensu. 100% of our monitoring setup is in config management and source control. I've got Sensu subscriptions that are based on Chef rules, so the right checks are looking for the right services everywhere. Means that there's no alert fatigue or missed alerts that can happen when you bring up a new server or a server changes roles and you forget to update the monitoring configuration, which happens. We're human, we forget things. But Chef runs and it updates the roles and it doesn't forget to do that. The Sensu checks are defined in Chef as well, with a deploy process in place so that nobody can sneak checks into production. Because trust me, you don't want to realize that the developers have access because you're woken up at 4 in the morning and you say, what is this alert? Where did it get here? Why do I even care about this? Don't let the developers do that. These are the tools that you use every day to make sure that your site or your app or whatever you're building is doing the right thing. So you owe it to yourselves to make sure that they're behaving properly and aren't going to fall apart on you. Just because these monitoring tools aren't customer-facing doesn't mean that they aren't important and aren't worth the time to do right, because they absolutely are. I'm personally a big fan of Sensu, but whatever tools you end up using, make sure you're using them correctly and make sure that you have processes built up around them to keep them that way. Now, while you're busy making sure that the existing tools and products are reliable, it's also important to develop new products and features with monitoring in mind. Like, monitoring should never be something that, oh, it's in production and we forgot to monitor it. You need to get this done 5 minutes ago, yesterday, last week. Checks should be in place before something goes into production. And there needs to be enough communication between teams in your organization so that everyone knows what needs to be monitored and what doesn't. Also, keep in mind the cost of monitoring something. If there is some cool feature, but there is no reliable way to automatically monitor it, consider the cost of having people do that by hand on a bunch of mobile devices. If the cost of that in terms of salary and in terms of what other work those people could be doing and those interruptions, if that cost is higher than the benefit from that feature, no matter how cool it is, you might want to consider that it's not worth it at this point. But regardless of where you come off on those trade-offs, for everything that needs to be monitored, you need to plan this out from the beginning, not after it's been in front of customers. Now, I like to practice what I call monitoring-driven development. So similar to test-driven development, where code is written in response to a failing test, in monitoring-driven development, features and services are turned on in response to a failing monitoring check. So before we add something in production, we add a check for it. And at this point, it should be failing, because how could it be passing if the service doesn't exist yet? Once the check is failing, then you add the service. And at this point, if you've done everything right, if you're really lucky, the check should start passing. But you might need to, tweak a few things, adjust some thresholds and so on. But you iterate on this until what you expect to see and what you actually do see are the same thing. Profit. This helps you make sure that you know that your monitoring is doing what you expect. Because when you add a new service or a new feature, it's important. You want to make sure that it's actually working properly, not that you are just failing to check for failure. It's also good to test your monitoring from time to time. Something like the Netflix Chaos Monkey, in addition to testing resiliency, can be used to test your monitoring setup. But if you don't have the actual Chaos Monkey, maybe you don't have auto-scaling in EC2 or whatever, you can do this by hand. Stop some services, shut down some EC2 instances, unplug some things in the data center, and make sure that your monitoring actually alerts you to those issues that you just caused. It's fun for the whole team, but be a team player. Maybe let the rest of your team know that you're doing this, and maybe don't do this at 3 a.m. if you're not the person holding the pager. So at this point, you should notice that you're getting a lot of work done, because your teams get to spend their time doing useful and meaningful work instead of just firefighting or restarting Rails all the time. If you were previously in a monitoring sucks situation where you just hired a bunch of people to stare at those graphs, you might need to reevaluate your teams at this point. You might not need a big NOC full of low-level people who all they do is stare at Xenos and let you know when it's not doing the right thing. You might need to hire then a smaller team of your developers or your system engineers or your DevOps or what have you, because that's the kind of work that you can now focus on, is the actual engineering work. But however you end up organizing your teams, you want to avoid that kind of silo mentality. So having shared tools and processes can help with this. Something like you could have Trello for your entire organization. Each team could have their own Trello board with their own columns and their own labels for the cards and what have you. But different teams can then see each other's boards. They can see what's going on, maybe add comments, maybe even add cards, but there's visibility across the organization. Or chat rooms in HipChat or what have you that are open to more than one team, which is simple but often overlooked. Or just encourage a culture where teams talk to each other on a regular basis, and that's a regular and good thing to have happen, not just teams don't just talk to each other when they're escalating something or when the shit's hit the fan and they absolutely have to. It's amazing how much more productive your teams can be when they actually like each other and don't just view work as a zero-sum game, where good news for dev necessarily means bad news for ops and vice versa. So throughout this whole process, you're going to want to build up a bunch of trust and communication in your organization. I really, really can't stress this enough. If you can't trust your team to do their jobs and to do them well, you either have trust issues or you need a new team. If people are passing the buck or leaving things for the next shift or just don't do any work if they aren't being micromanaged, you need a new team. People should be able to trust at all levels of organization that their coworkers are doing quality work but also aren't going to throw them under the bus. This is where things like blameless postmortems are really important. Additionally, organizational transparency. There's better morale, better productivity if people aren't worried that their jobs are going to be outsourced or that their salaries are going to be cut to save a few bucks. So communication goes hand in hand with this. Different teams need to know what's going on. So the dev team needs to communicate what features they're working on and when those are going to be in production so stuff gets monitored when it needs to be. Additionally, the ops team, whoever is doing the monitoring, needs to communicate that there's outages or that there's bugs that need to be fixed to the dev team instead of just sweeping stuff under the rug and hoping that nobody notices and yells at them. Effective communication is really key here. At Game Changer, we're small enough that we have what we call one team, one dream, where dev and ops are actually kind of the same team. We call it the web team. But we have one Trello board, we have one 10-minute stand-up in the morning, and that works for us. But the key is find out what works for you as your organization grows, as it scales. If you find that your meetings are starting to drag on longer than they used to, or people are no longer reading the status emails that get sent, don't be afraid to stop doing that. Don't keep doing it just because you always have been, and figure out what will work for you now. And that's a pretty good idea of what winning looks like. So nobody stares at graphs. Nobody tosses things over the wall. People communicate and they feel like they're all on the same team, regardless of how the organization is actually structured. People are doing quality work instead of just firefighting, instead of just staring at Xenos. And monitoring is mature enough that people get to focus on big picture engineering questions. So pick good tools, pick better people. Don't stare at graphs. Thank you. Yeah, any questions? All right. If you want to hear me complain, slightly less these days, again, I'm on Twitter. There's occasionally cat pictures. Thanks.